Welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand of the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump into the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. As I say, every single week, it's the lifeline to the show and it's how we keep the podcast going. If you can, please just go over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast. Check out the rewards. The main one is the bonus episode that we do. It's a form of a Q&A each week with the guests, and it's just a bumper to that main show. And if you can support via that, it's just a 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcasts, and a like and a share. But let's get into today's show. It's a new year, and I'm thrilled to be joined by a very familiar face, and that is Dr. Mathias Nordvig. He needs no introduction.
Hello, everybody.
There we go. He's back.
Welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. We are joined today by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Yeah, so you're still the associate teaching professor at Colorado Boulder, and man of many talents, book writer, well, author would be the better phrase.
Yeah, I guess so.
Bookcase builder, as we spoke about before.
Right, yeah, the bookcase behind me. I mean, if you write books, you also should have the skills to build the bookcase for them, right? So.
For sure, yeah. So how's life? Why don't we fill everyone in on how life is for you, for any new additions?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So since last time we talked, when was the last time we talked? It's been a while, hasn't it?
It has been, yeah. It's been a little while. I can't remember when the last episode was we did. Let me see if I can pull it up whilst you let us know.
Well, I in the meantime, I can continue and say, well, I had another kid. That kid is growing and becoming more of a human. And published some books and and what else? We had Vadrona and Einar Selvik at CU back in October.
I saw that. What was that for?
Well, I mean, it's usually when Einar comes through Colorado, I'm like, hey, come do something at the university. Make life more interesting for my students.
They have to love that, surely.
Yeah, no, it was well attended. We had full house of audience, both students and the public and faculty and a bunch of people. So
you get to be the cool teacher on campus for a day.
Yeah, and I also get to heckle Einar from the back while he's talking. No, that's incorrect.
Well, yeah, you may as well. So you wrote some books. What's the latest one?
I mean, academic stuff. We have the Ancestral North that you talked with Ross Hagen about a couple of months ago. I unfortunately couldn't join you guys for that one because I was so busy writing another book.
Okay, is it a non-academic book?
No, the other one the one that I've been writing over the last couple of months is an academic book as well.
Oh, okay.
It's sort of like an overall introduction to Old Norse mythology, in the appropriate Matthias fashion, basically. Old Norse mythology doesn't exist. Here's why. It's complicated.
Yeah, there we go. Which is the topic we're gonna look at today. When we spoke about doing this episode, and you gave me the topic of basically just does Old Norse religion mythology exist? I was thrilled. I was like, well, that's typical Matthias. That's gonna be the typical kind of let's get everybody riled up episode.
I'm doing what I can.
So where do we start with that? What do you mean by Old Norse mythology doesn't exist?
Well, it's of course tongue in cheek and facetious because it does exist. I mean, it is Old Norse mythology is something that is written down. It exists as a type of literature. But when you start digging into that literature, that's when you also start realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's something going on here. That, actually, see, this happens every time.
You know what? This hasn't happened for months. We haven't had anybody leave their microphone on, and then you come back on, and that's it. Everyone's too excited.
Yeah. So what I was saying was that once you start digging into Old Norse mythology as that literature, that's when you start realizing that, wait, there's something going on here that, it doesn't add up in terms of what we think Old Norse mythology is, right?
Okay.
And there are several layers to that. One, Old Norse mythology is not pre-Christian Nordic religion. Those two things are not the same. The literature that we have. Yeah.
Does that mean you have to? Because how do you separate mythology and religion? And is it even possible to do that? Because obviously there are a lot of people, if you call, I see people all the time when we, through Horns of Odin, if we use the word mythology, we'll get a bunch of people who write in the comment, basically we're being offensive by referring to it as myth or mythology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the first complication that we're actually dealing with. Like, what does it mean to say myth and mythology? And, and nowadays we have this idea that myth means something not true. And so that's why people get offended when they hear that. And that's, also applies to the term mythology, right? Because that is, essentially means the teachings of those myths, or the teaching about those myths. That is a term that's applied to this, I call it the story world, right? The Nordic story world. That term is applied to the Nordic story world back in the 19th century, where scholars are parsing out the difference between Christianity and other religions, essentially, right? And these pre-Christian religions, they get this term mythology attached to them instead. And that term mythology is entirely associated with the literature, not the lived religion, even though it sometimes crosses over in different ways. So nobody in pre-Christian Scandinavia would have called it mythology or anything similar. They didn't have a word for it like that.
Would they have called it religion? Would they have even identified it as a religion? Was that a thing?
Not really, right? Again, the term religion is also marked by Christianity in Western culture. Religion signifies something very specific to a lot of people nowadays, which is why you hear a lot of people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, or something like that, if they want to detach themselves from institutionalized religion. From the perspective of, history of religion, all of it is religion. Also, the things that are called spiritualities, it's all religion. But, that's another conversation, another can of worms that we can always open. But mythology proper comes into existence as we know it in context of the North in the 13th century. And this is where Snorri Sturluson writes Edda, the primary book on Old Norse mythology. He takes a bunch of stories, some interpretations of these stories, some theoretical framework, and a bunch of nonsense, and puts it all together and creates a book that he presents to us. And he tells us straight up in that book, don't believe in this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, you should not believe in this as religion. You should not assume that these stories are true in any other way than I present them right here. And he tells you exactly how to present them, how he's presenting them as well. He tells you that all these stories are parables of events from the Trojan War. So he's telling us that, and he specifically goes into the story about Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. He says, when Thor is fishing for the Midgard serpent, this is actually just a story about how Hector and Achilles were fighting, and Achilles managed to escape, and Hector then killed some other guy named Brotrus or something like that. I can't remember his name exactly, or maybe it was, yeah. And he sort of like, he interprets the characters of the fishing expedition based on characters from the Iliad.
Does he do that in a way to discredit the mythology, or to give like some credence to it in the real world?
It is 100% to discredit the mythology as a basis for religious beliefs, right? And to turn it into mythology, right? Mythology is like this stagnant piece of literature, essentially. So, he what he does is that he also starts his book off with this prologue where he tells us how Odin migrated from Troy in Asia, which is, it's kind of nebulous where that location actually is. And depending on the source, it can be either in what is now modern day Turkey, or even farther into what might be like modern day Iran, or even like, Kazakhstan or somewhere. So like Central Asia. And the whole purpose of this is to also explain pre-Christian Nordic religion as something that is foreign to Northern Europe. So it's like migrant religion, and our ancestors didn't really believe this. Some of them were fooled. That's why we have this goofy Swedish king who's like being told all these stories, and then he goes back to his kingdom and tells everybody the stories, and then that's how people ended up believing it, right?
Yeah, so it's a way to say, you guys might have believed this before, but we now know the truth, and this is, it did exist, but you were wrong. They weren't actual gods.
It's like the Christian version, like the medieval Christian version of somebody saying, oh, back in the day, they believed that Thor created thunder, but now we know that it's, friction in the atmosphere. Right?
Yeah. Okay. I always love when I come across people, I still frequent the Facebook groups. I still, I still lurk. And I always love it when you see people using the prose edit to like fight a corner, but they've never clearly read it, and just completely ignore all the references of Christianity and heaven, and the whether liking the two together. And it's always so fascinating how people can just twist, take things out of context to just use it to fit whatever on both sides. Because you can take, if you're trying to explain it, as the way it probably is intended, you can take it and say, well, he was discrediting the Old Norse religion. Or you can, if you take it the other way, if you want to take it out of context and leave the little bits out the mention of Christianity, you can also use it to defend it.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where we need to understand what this guy is actually doing all of this for, right? And he is, again, very explicit about that. Snorri Sturluson says, I am giving you these stories because I want to preserve skaldic poetry. That's really it. He says, if skaldic poetry is composed in the right way, and if it's interpreted correctly, then you're able to extract historical knowledge from it. And the reason Snorri says this, and perhaps others in his time, is that this is their primary source to their history. These people from Scandinavia, Iceland, Northern Europe in general, all they really have, aside from carvings and runes here and there, is the skaldic poetry that mentions various kings and various heroes, and probably also a bunch of other things, but we don't have a lot of that left because they didn't really bother to write much of that down. But we can see that actually also in Edda. There is some skaldic poetry that's centered solely on the Old Norse gods, for instance, which means that there likely to have been more of that out there. But he says that, well, we have all this historical material in poetry. So if we interpret the poetry, we can understand history, our part of the world's history, right? That's mostly focused on the dynasties of kings, which is why, the compilation of Norwegian kings sagas, Heimskringla, begins with a very long skaldic poem, Ynglingatal, right? That's the dynasty of the Ynglings, which is supposedly the ones who founded the Norwegian royal dynasty. So this is why that material is important. That's why Snorri Sturluson is like, well, we need to keep this material alive in our time. And so he writes this book where he gives us all of these interpretations of Old Norse mythology. And he very clearly also uses Christian texts like the Elucidarius, which is a medieval text that sort of like gives us an all-round introduction to Christianity, essentially. He uses that text to interpret aspects of Old Norse mythology. That's why you have like a division between like light elves and dark elves that comes straight from interpretations of biblical material.
So, okay. So we have, for anybody who's listened to this show for long enough, you have obviously the prose Edda, the poetic Edda, and that's kind of it mainly for what we know about the mythology. And obviously there are archaeological finds which can reference back to it, and you can try and tie them together. But they're the written sources, and it seems as though you're saying those two can't, or at least the prose Edda can't really be trusted. And that's where we get a lot of the stories from, a lot of the fun stories from.
Okay, so let me just saw the branch off completely here.
Okay.
Because the poetic Edda, you can't trust that one either.
Well, I was just thinking, I remember the episode, I remember it quite clearly, the episode with Bob Van Strien when I was sat in my old studio, and I think we ended up calling the episode Edible Edda. And you, yeah, and you told me that the poetic Edda was written down after the prose Edda, and that was a mind-blowing moment for me. And I think it probably is for a lot of people, and I've quoted that since a lot of times, and people still argue back on it, because I think as soon as you get into this, you're kind of told the poetic Edda is probably a little bit more trustworthy. It's older, but it's like older in material, not in, being written down. And the prose Edda is maybe a little bit more sketchy, but that's kind of how it's put out there. And then when you find out, oh no, actually this was written down after the prose Edda, it still can't really be trusted, I guess, as much.
No, it's all sketchy. That's the situation. Okay, so yeah. In 1220, Snorri Sturluson writes the prose Edda. In 1270, some unknown person writes down several of the poems that we refer to as the poetic Edda. Because not all the poems come from that same book. In 1300, someone else writes another little manuscript that includes some of these poems as well. And then in 1325, roughly 30 at the latest, I think, Haukur Erlendsson, who was a law speaker in Iceland in the late 1200s or early 1300s, I can't remember exactly, but around that time, he writes a book with a lot of interesting material in it. And there you also get an Eddic poem, one of the poems that we typically call Eddic poems. And he also, puts in other material that is interesting, relevant to Old Norse mythology. And then we have other sources that also have a little bit of this and that here and there. And here's the kicker, too. We don't have Snorri Sturluson's original text from 1220, so we don't have the original prose Edda. We only have copies of it from 1300 and later, right? So those copies, some of those copies, they also include poems that we call Eddic poems. So, it's all a, big mix.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, too, that means, right, that any scholar who wants to translate Snorri Sturluson's Edda has to sit down with, I would say, at least 3 manuscripts, 3 different manuscripts, but appropriately 4, and, correlate them with each other and look at the differences in wording, because there's differences in, how they were written down. We also see that a little bit with the Eddic poems, but most of the Eddic poems really only have 1 version. There are some that have 2 versions, and we can see a little bit of difference in the wordings here and there, which actually, becomes quite interesting with certain stanzas where, one version says one thing and another version says another thing, and the difference is like massive in meaning, right? Like for instance, in Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, we have a line. I don't remember the stanza specifically, but it's about this woman named Heider who does Seidr, right? This Old Norse pre-Christian magic, and depending on the version that you get in the different manuscripts, it's either she was always the delight of evil women or always the delight of evil people, right?
Okay.
Or she took the attention of evil people or something like that, right? So those are big differences in meaning, right? That's the kind of stuff that we get. And then imagine a whole prose text that's like that, right? And with Snorri Sturluson's Edda, the oldest one is kind of the worst version.
Okay.
Right. So we have one from 1300. That's the Uppsala manuscript. It's kept in the library in Uppsala in Sweden. That one is very abbreviated, and there's a lot of questions left by the text, essentially, right? Then you have the Codex Regius manuscript of the prose Edda from 1200 sorry, not 1200, 13 something, 1320 to 30, maybe into the middle of that century. That one.
Sorry to interrupt. Do we know whether, because you said 4 manuscripts, if you possibly 3, but ideally 4. Do we know that all 4 of those were copied from the Snorri's original, or is it possible that some of those were copied from the oldest copy?
Some of them are definitely copied from other copies, right?
So okay.
We know that, yeah. And that's why that's the thing too, right? Because the Codex Regius from the middle of the 14th century, that one is sort of more of a complete text, which, you want a more complete text when you're trying to present a complete text, right? So you're like, yes, we should have that one. We should work with that one, right? But that one, you can't trust it either, right? And so this is where all of these complexities show up, and this is where we then end up with, Old Norse mythology doesn't exist, because Old Norse mythology is something that we create as translators, right? When we sit down and we decide to translate Snorri Sturluson's Edda, we have to use 4 different manuscripts, and we have to make choices based on those 4 different manuscripts. And it's the same with the poetry. We have a text from 1270 that has certain poems. We have one from the beginning of the 1300s, and then we have a bunch of poems scattered in other material. And we say that these are Eddic poems because they have a certain meter. And because they have that meter, we throw them in over here in this translation, right? So if you open any translation of Eddic poems, you'll find primarily the texts from the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda, and then you'll find some from the AM 748 Quarto. That's the sexy title of that manuscript.
Nice.
And then you'll also find some that have been sourced from copies of Snorri Sturluson's Edda and from other books as well that are just like traditionally considered Eddic poetry. And then there's, of course, the fact that nobody ever called it Eddic poetry back in the day. This is, again, something that we've come up with because we have all of this poetry that's composed in different meters. Those meters are called different things. Like Völuspá is composed in Fornyrðislag, which means the meter of ancient sayings. Hávamál is composed in Ljóðaháttur, which means like a song meter or something like that. So that's like two different types of poetry, essentially, that we then call Eddic poetry, because some dude in 17th century Iceland misunderstood things. Actually, that's where that comes down to.
So it's complicated, is what you're saying.
It is complicated, but there are things. But there are things too that we can absolutely see that this material does have root in something prior to the conversion, or far down in the Viking Age. There are stories that are very clearly attached to imagery that we can see on rock carvings from Viking Age Scandinavia, like Odin's eight-legged horse is a good example of it, right? Like there is depictions of eight-legged horses on the island of Gotland from around 800. Right. So there's something going on there, but whether or not that figure on those stones in Gotland is actually Sleipnir, and the person riding that eight-legged horse is actually Odin, that's another question, because it didn't come with a name tag.
Yeah. Okay. The thing that comes to mind is have you ever seen the Loki stone? That's in it's like in a church in North Yorkshire, and it's just attributed to being Loki, even though, like you say, it doesn't have a tag. It's just like a devil that's kind of bound, and it's from that time period. And it makes me think of that in a sense of that people have just attributed this to being Loki, but in reality, there's nothing really to say that it is. And it feels like it's all that kind of thing that we're just having to. It's tough because I don't want to. You don't want to shit on everything that everybody knows about, but it's almost like people kind of need to understand that there has to be an asterisk by a lot of things, and it's tough to say because whenever anybody learns something new, or they get interested in a topic or a new religion, then you want absolutes and you want to be able to put it in your life. And then when somebody comes along and says, well, you can do that, but maybe this isn't true, maybe this isn't true. Not everybody's comfortable sitting in that kind of unknown area going, oh, maybe this is, maybe that is, I'm not quite sure. We just want things to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's always the annoying thing about it, right? It's like, oh, I've just found my truth here, and then some jerk like me shows up, and it's like, well, actually, but I mean, I actually personally, I think this makes it all a lot more interesting, because it raises some big questions about the role of these stories. You mentioned Loki on the supposed Loki on that stone. Well, okay, so what is the factor that makes people identify this figure with Loki? Well, oh, it's a figure that is bound. We have that in the mythology. Loki was bound. And then you can go to the Gosforth cross,
Well,
or
that was the other one that I was thinking. Is that
yeah,
the one that's got Thor fishing for Jormungandr on it? And
yes. Well, it's got two guys fishing.
okay, well, yeah. Again, well,
one of them has what looks like a hammer, right?
yeah. So I'm guilty of it. There is that it's that association, isn't it? That there's an
But
image.
it's not an unreasonable one, because so there's a difference here. There's a difference between the depiction of the bound Loki and Thor fishing, because Thor fishing shows up on multiple stones, and there's consistency in the imagery. So this is one of the stories that's, actually, very well documented in Old Norse mythology. The fishing expedition, we have it on the Gosforth Cross. We have it on the Herdum Stone in Denmark, which could be as old as the 700s and as late as the 1100s. We actually don't really know. Then we have it on Altuna, a stone in Sweden from around 1000. And it is very clearly a figure with a hammer. And then that detail of his foot going through the bottom of the boat. And Snorri Sturluson writes that. Snorri Sturluson gives us the story about Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. And he writes that when he was pulling up the serpent, his foot or his feet went through the boat, bottom of the boat, and he was standing on the bottom of the ocean. And we also have that story in versions in poetry, where that is actually not explicated anywhere. We have the poem Hymiskviða, or Hymia's poem, an Eddic poem. It tells us the story about how Thor fished for the Midgard serpent with Hymir. There's no mention of him standing, his foot going through the boat and standing on the seabed. And we also have skaldic poetry going as far back as the 800s, just like single stanzas mentioning the fishing expedition. And they also don't talk about that feature of the foot through the boat. So it's only Snorri, this otherwise pretty sketchy source from 1220, and then these depictions in England, in Denmark, and in Sweden, right? So that tells us then that there's got to be some truth to what Snorri Sturluson is saying here and there, because there's no indication that he ever saw a depiction of the fishing expedition. Right?
Yeah.
He just knew a story, and he probably knew multiple versions too. You can see that in what he's writing. Because there's also in what he does when he gives us that story, he actually refers to, some people say that he killed the serpent, but I actually think that he didn't. And that's because Snorri Sturluson meets the serpent at the end in Ragnarok. And now people are going to be like, yeah, well, it also says that in the prophecy of the Seers. Yeah, no, it actually might not. Because in the prophecy of the Seers, there are two versions of that stanza that mentions that Thor fights the Midgard serpent at Ragnarok. And one stanza actually very clearly says it's a wolf.
Really?
Yeah.
There you go. Because on the Gosforth cross, isn't above that, isn't there like an image of a god holding like a serpent? I'm sure it's in like the idea that Thor couldn't kill Jormungandr, but God can. And this kind of again, these crosses were made to kind of discredit the old religion. So it's kind of like, oh well, the Almighty God can kill the serpent where Thor couldn't.
If that is actually the case, yeah. So the thing about the depictions of on that cross, right, is that there's like a depiction of what seems to be a bound figure and a woman holding a bowl over his head. We quote unquote know that from Old Norse mythology, because we have the story about how Loki is bound after he has had a hand in killing Balder. That's his punishment. He's bound on the ground. We know from these stories that Skadi specifically puts a snake over his head that drips poison into his face, right? So Sigyn sits and holds that bowl. Now, the thing about that is that those stories only come from Snorri Sturluson's prose and from a epilogue in prose after the poem called Lokasenna, so Loki's quarrel, right? Which could be a late poem. It could also be an earlier poem. That's another can of worms. That's like the age of these poems, because some of these poems are very clearly composed in the 13th century. They're very clearly composed after Snorri Sturluson's Edda was written, and they're very clearly composed by people who actually had read, or at least knew, parts of Snorri Sturluson's Edda as well. So that little prose epilogue here telling us how Loki was punished in that poem might as well come from Snorri Sturluson's Edda than anywhere else. And so that brings us back to Snorri, and where did he get that idea from? And this is the open question. It's like, okay, so how are these stories actually circulating, right? So what happens back in the 10th century when the Gosforth cross is put up, right? And that cross has like these depictions on it. Okay, we assume that this is about Nordic mythology. It's Cumbria, so I guess that's reasonable, right? It's Cumbria with, you know, in the 10th century, so there's like a decent, you know, Scandinavian population. But here's what I don't get about all of this, and that is, I mean, these Scandinavians that come over to England, they seem to convert to Christianity pretty quickly. Like, so if you have the great heathen army in the middle of the 800s and the influx of Scandinavians, so those Scandinavians who are like littering the English countryside with place names, right? I mean, they seem to convert. So what is that cross really about? Is it a cross that's like discrediting Old Norse mythology? Is it a cross that's actually telling stories that were already discrediting Old Norse mythology? Stories that were, you know, generated in the 800s.
Am I right in thinking that in this stave churches across Scandinavia that, so this was I can't remember the name of what's the biggest stave church called in Norway?
Is it Borgund? I can't remember which one is the biggest one.
No, there's one. It's like a really famous one just outside of Oz, maybe like a couple of hours outside Oslo. I can't remember it. When I visited there, I remember the guide said how there was figures on top of the staves, you know, the posts of there were like god figures, and it was an idea of this assimilation between Christianity and the old, or an idea that is what it could be, as to make people maybe feel a little more comfortable in that transitionary period. And could that be a similar thing with these crosses? Because it's not just the Gosforth cross. There's tons of crosses that have both like Scandinavian and kind of Christian iconography on there. Could it be that it's just a little bit of like making it a little bit easier? I was going to say like to lube it up a little bit.
I mean, yeah, probably in a way. I think that could be part of it, but what I think is actually more the case is that imagine a situation where, you know, people have been telling the same stories or similar stories for centuries, right? At least. They've designed a whole little society around those stories. They've legitimized the rule of kings and the separations of lands and a bunch of other things based off of that. When you then show up with a new religion and have them convert, you can't just get rid of all of this stuff. It's not just about being comfortable. It's about what makes sense, what is meaningful, right? And so these stories are going to stick around in different ways. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily pagan still, just because these people are telling these stories. It just means that this is still relevant stuff. And we know this today too, because we still have folklore and folk tales and all that stuff hanging around, even though we don't need folk tales to explain why things happen around us, right? We have science and medicine and stuff that can explain why you get a cramp in your back, and it's not an elf that shot an arrow at you. It's it's a muscle spasm, right? Like those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So that's simply why, I think, right? And if you think about how people love those old stories, how they love rituals and ideas attached to the folk tales, right? We just came out of the Christmas period, and the Christmas period is all about that, right? So like humans just don't function in the way that they're like, oh, okay, so new knowledge, we're going to apply that in our world and just live by that. If that were the case, we probably wouldn't be existing in this shit show, right?
Yeah. I was quickly just Googling the Gosforth cross, because I don't think it's the one that when I mentioned about the god figure holding the serpent, I don't think it's that one that I was.
I think, could that be, what is it called, Kirk Andrews or something like that?
Maybe, because when I looked at the picture of it, it's the one that I'm thinking of is like on a cliff edge almost, and it's really weathered. It's in Cumbria, but it's the churchyard overlooks almost like the sea. When I googled the Gosforth cross, it wasn't the one that I was thinking of, so I just wanted to kind of correct myself. But I know there is one there somewhere, and the Heddle Church is the one that I was thinking. That's
right.
The little figures.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm familiar with those little faces carved in there, and I mean, I kind of feel like it's a stretch to say that they have anything to do with the Old Norse gods, but then again, I also don't want to discount it.
Yeah.
Because if you dig into, for instance, runic inscriptions from medieval Norway, like closing in on the 1400s, you find references to Valkyries and elves and trolls and those kinds of things. So it's not impossible that this lives on in different ways. But what happens over time is that this older material just become more and more marginalized, right? And Christian mythology takes center, right, in people's lives. And it's mostly just like a gradual development of like this is the norm, right? But then at some point, you also get the introduction of like violent attempts to change people's minds that of course also happens at certain points.
Okay, we've got about, let's say 15 minutes ish left of like the main show. When we've kind of established what you mean by Old Norse mythology doesn't exist, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's maybe it doesn't exist as how we know it or how we interpret it and we translate it. How close do you think it is? And is it possible to ever know how close it may be, how Snorri's version may be? And is it even a case, because when you threw this idea to me, I thought we were going to go in the direction of that we're talking about quite a big geographical area, a decent time span, maybe 400 years, that it would be impossible to say that there is one singular mythology, because everybody, depending on whether you're by the coast or inland, it would be different because you would pray to different gods. That's the direction I thought we were going to go in. So yeah, do you think the even if you reduce it down more, that we look at Snorri's and that's like just one version of his telling of what this mythology is. What do you think the landscape actually looked like when it came to like a mythology or religion?
Yeah. So what you're saying is also incredibly relevant for, our understanding of Old Norse mythology, and pre-Christian religion. This is where I make the distinction between Old Norse mythology and pre-Christian religion. When we talk about, a belief system, rituals, behavior, and thoughts and ideas that existed prior to people converting to Christianity, then I call that pre-Christian religion. Preferably actually pre-Christian religions, in plural, because of exactly what you're highlighting here. What kinds of differences can we expect? You pointed out geographical differences. That would have been one important difference. We can see that in the place name material. We can see how different place names that reference different deities are dispersed differently across Scandinavia. The god Utler does not exist in the Danish area in place names. The god Tyr hardly exists in the Scandinavian peninsula, but had many place names in the Danish area. There's 2 Norwegian place names possibly, and that's it, right? So there's differences there. Then there's probably also class differences when it comes to what type of religion are you practicing, depending on whether you're a member of elite society, you're a peasant, you're a slave, you're a man, you're a woman, right? That's gender differences.
But obviously, I completely understand that. But when it comes to things like Christianity, it doesn't matter what class you are; it's all the same God. So could that not be the same with pre-Christian
No,
religion?
actually, I think that's one of the things that made Christianity so successful. That
it's because it's just one for everybody.
Yeah, because in at least in principle, ideally in Christianity, there's an introduction of at least a spiritual equality, and that does not look like it existed in Europe prior to conversion. And go back to Greece, Rome, and you'll see just how they come up with various distinctions, right? Spiritual, religious distinctions. So I think actually Christianity was successful exactly because it circumvented that crusty hierarchy associated with paganism. And that is likely to have been the same in the North. But were there unifying rituals and stuff like that? Yes, there were. I mean, we have those. It looks like in pre-Christian Scandinavia, there would be these central sites that people would go to and gather there, and it kind of looks like everybody went. But again, you have to ask yourself, could you go if you were just some random peasant living on some lord's land or that kind of stuff? That's maybe not. It's hard to really parse out because we don't have that good source material for understanding that, right?
But do you think that a religious site on the west coast of Norway would be the same as Uppsala? Would they? Do you think they would look the same, or do you think they would look? Because obviously, I guess they're kind of shrouded in the same quote unquote mythology. That it's probably going to be the same figures. But do you think if you took one, because maybe the odd person might travel if you're if you're a scholar, but the everyday person is never going to interact from the west coast of Norway to the east coast of Sweden. They're never going to interact like we do today. It's easy. We have the internet.
Well.
Oh, piss
Okay,
off!
so a couple
Piss
of
off!
things.
Go away again.
Archaeologically, we can see that there is similar trends in the construction of these sites. That is the case. We can identify central sites in pre-Christian Scandinavia based on their similarities. It's the same with the graves, right? We can see that the graves, they have variation in different ways, but they also follow the same patterns, right? They're expressions of the same culture. So that's an important thing to consider. And yeah, that doesn't mean that there weren't also differences in different ways. And I like that you're saying West Coast Norway and East Coast Sweden, because that would probably be the most complicated or annoying like travel route to deal with.
Yeah. Did
Because
you
that
see
one,
me? Did you see me working out my compass in my mind before I did it? I was like, naughty elephants spray water. I was like, just to make sure I didn't embarrass myself.
I didn't notice. So
I did it with my eyes. I was like,
you hide it well, so don't worry. But no, like, I mean, I think what we would see more of is differences based on what is the geographical layout, the geology of a location, when we're talking about um, how the physical world impacts people's religion. And there's Sweden seems more wood centered. Denmark seems more water centered, and Norway seems more mountain centered, right? And that makes perfect sense because of the way that the locations look. But did people interact? Yeah, they did. Did they move around? Yeah, they did. We tend to think of the past as a time where people probably didn't travel a lot, but they actually did travel more than we assume.
okay.
And there were more people coming through an area too than we assume in general, for different reasons, right? We have travel by boat for the purpose of fishing and trade and visiting your aunt or something like that, right? That happens. We have travel by horseback for the purpose of trade, sending messages, leading an army, all the basic things. So there is a lot more commotion than we normally assume.
But do you think if even if they traveled, let's say the extremes like the west coast of Norway, east coast of Sweden, even if they traveled and went and saw, let's say, what was happening in a temple on the east coast of Sweden, they would still take those ideas back and do the same thing, or would it just be could it be just two completely different, not completely different things, but like the same kind of basic thing, but just done differently because it's splintered
I think
off?
I think there would be some solid differences, but there would also be consistency enough that it would be recognizable and people would be like, yeah, we're doing the same thing.
Okay.
And we can see that there's some cultural hints to this. And one of them is actually, the fact that the kings or jarls or whatever they are, these like, magnates in the Viking Age, they do the same things, whether they are in Denmark or in Sweden or in Norway. And they employ the same people. And they are interested in having a scout, a court poet. And that court poet has the same function whether he's in Denmark or he's in Sweden or he's in Norway, or more appropriately, whether he's in this particular region in Sweden and this particular region in Norway, because keep in mind that these weren't actually nation states at the time. We had like local rulers all over the place here. And it's even the similarities even go beyond just Scandinavia, right? You would probably see somebody from West Coast Norway if they entered the Baltics or farther into Russia and encountered Slavic paganism. They would be like, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. It's because the similarities would be so great that it would be translatable, even though the languages might be different and you don't understand what people are saying. you'll probably be able to recognize, okay, this is this is familiar. This is, I know what we're doing here. What would be different to these people would be, Christianity or Islam for that matter. Like this is where they would be like, oh wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, because it's completely different.
Yeah.
But I know we can't base everything on place names, but if you look at just that as an idea, do you think that different regions would have, even just within Scandinavia and I guess like Viking occupied Britain, do you think in those areas, I'm trying to think how to word it, do you think that Odin would always be like the top and then you would have the gods underneath? Or do you think in different regions you would have maybe Thor would be the pinnacle, and then in Denmark where you find the Tyr, now obviously you can go into the argument of whether Tyr and Odin are the
Or
same.
whether Tia even existed. That's another
Yeah, okay.
conversation.
But what I'm getting at is, do you think that each
Mhm.
maybe different regions would have a different kind of head of the pantheon? We have obviously this idea that most people ascribe to because it comes from Snorri of like Odin being the top, then you have like Thor and Loki, and that's kind of how it's set out.
Mhm.
But do you think different regions that might have jostled about and changed a little bit?
Absolutely. And also, I would strongly question the existence of a pantheon altogether
Okay.
in a lot of cases. I mean, this is the pantheon idea, and Odin as the leader of the pantheon is very much a Snorri construction. It probably comes before Snorri, but he's the one who cements it in Old Norse mythology. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, he literally says Odin is like the head of this pantheon. He doesn't use the word
Yeah.
pantheon, but that's what he says, and that's because all the other gods are his children, and it's like, what? That's not. I mean, he's constantly also like synthesizing conflicting information. And at one point, he says that Odin and Jörth, the Earth, are like married, and he also says that she's his daughter. And
Mm-hmm.
in another instance, she's married to someone else. Like this, he's taking conflicting information and sometimes trying to align it as well. And there could be many reasons for why that is happening, but I think one reason is absolutely that he's working with older material that comes from many different places.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, most of it comes from Iceland, but keep in mind that these Icelanders come from many different places. They aren't just all from Western and North Central Norway. They came from a lot of different places, and they brought a lot of different ideas and material with them. And Snorri is very obviously, in certain cases, this I think the best place where we can see that in his literature is when he talks about the wolves in the sky and sun and moon and day and night and all that stuff. He is trying to align multiple stories about what goes on the celestial plane in Old Norse mythology. He's
Mm-hmm.
bringing in multiple stories because he is himself perhaps a little confused. Like there's like a horse that draws like day, and there's one that draws night, and then there's like sun and moon are also riding horses, and it's like there's a bunch of horses here, and I don't really know what's going on, but let's just like call this like a myth about day and night, and that one a myth about the sun and the
Mm-hmm.
moon, right? That's what
Yeah.
he's doing here, and that is probably because he's got multiple old stories about
Mm-hmm.
that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that we always have to remember as well that a lot of time passes, and I think when you look back on history, it's so easy to just think of 50 years as nothing, or 150 years, or sometimes even 500 years is a click of the fingers, and it's nothing. But in reality, 150 years is a long time.
It can be, yeah.
It can be a big distance, especially in an oral tradition that maybe if I tell somebody something today, I guarantee that the thing that they tell somebody next week would probably be slightly different than the tale that I told them, let alone when you're traveling hundreds of years. And yes, the backbone probably would stay the same, but all the little information around it would be filled in, changed, misremembered, altered, and that's kind of what
Also
happens.
for creativity
Yeah.
alone, right? Like, and yeah, I mean, that's an important part of it. Like, information only stays the same as long as it's relevant to a stable element in people's culture, right? So, you can have stories that persist, sort of like the same or similar for a very long time. But it's also very easy for everything to get restructured based
Yeah.
on new events in society.
Yeah, just tweak it a little bit because something happens
Yeah.
and make it fit your worldview. Matthias, let's wrap this up because I want to have like a little bit of time for people to ask you some questions from the chat because I know they will have missed your lovely face.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, where can people also find you, buy whatever you're working on at the minute, your books, support you?
Yeah, so you can always find me on Instagram just by my name. It's just Nordvig. That is the easiest way to get clued in on stuff that I do or hikes that I take on a mountain.
Yeah.
Whenever I get time to do that nowadays. And there's of course also my website. You can always check that, matthiasnordvig.com. And you should definitely be listening to my podcast, The Sacred Flame. It is not as regular as I want it to be, but I do put out new episodes. I have one coming very soon.
Nice.
So yeah, and that's like historical based philosophy or something like that. It ties into contemporary things and ideas. And the upcoming episode will take us to Mongolia and the Arabian Peninsula, through a bishop in El Salvador
Oh, nice.
in 1970s. So yeah, that's just and it
Wonderful.
all relates to Vikings, so don't worry about it.
Wonderful. All right, if you want to follow me, it's Daniel_Founder1. The business, Horns of Odin, and then the podcast is Nordic Mythology Podcast across the board. Go and have a look on YouTube, see our lovely faces, hit the little bell and subscribe button. And that's it. Let's wrap this up.